In order to start working with the database, we first need to import Mongoose. Again, Mongoose is our package that we use to interface with our MongoDB database. So we'll say const mongoose equals require mongoose. Then we also need reference to our store.js schema. And rather than importing this schema directly from the file, because we've already imported it once in our start.js file, remember require model store, we can simply reference it off the mongoose variable here, because mongoose uses a concept called a singleton, which allows us to only import our models once and then reference them anywhere in our application. So we'll say const capital S store equals mongoose.model capital S store. And that comes from, where did that capital S store come from? Well, at the bottom of our model, where we create the model here, we are setting it to be store. And here we are getting it and putting it back into this variable here. Good. Now let's go into our create store and let's talk about how to actually create a store with MongoDB. So the way that you do it is you say const lowercase s store equals new store, capital S, and then you pass it an object full of a name, a description, and the tags. So the way that we can do that, it's already in request.body. So we can just pass that directly from the body into our store. Now you may be saying like, well, what happens if somebody posts some other data that we don't necessarily want? Is that going to be a bit of an issue? Well, it's not an issue, because if you open up your store.js, we are using what's called a strict schema by default, and it will only pick up the actual fields that we have set out in the schema. Anything else will get thrown away. So we have our store. Now, in order to save this to the database, we just created the store here, and we could go ahead and add new stuff. So store.age equals 10, store.cool equals true. You can keep adding fields to your store, but none of that will be reflected in the database until you call store.save. And what that will do is once you call store.save, it's going to fire off a connection to your MongoDB database, save that data, and then come back to us with either the store itself or an error saying what happened. Maybe there's a validation error. Maybe there something missing data, incorrect data, you don't know. So at this point, we need to take sort of a look at the history of Mongoose and how it's been working. So in the olden days, what we would do is we would have a callback function, because JavaScript is asynchronous, meaning that if I were to call a bunch of code right here and maybe console log, it worked, or in our case, we're going to redirect them to maybe like the home page. What that's going to do is it's going to fire off the save and then redirect them to the home page. But the save will not happen immediately. The save will take some time, because this sort of stuff where if you ever do an AJAX request, you know that it takes time, or if you ever save some data to a database, it will take a little bit of time. But JavaScript will not wait for anybody because it's asynchronous by default. And what that means is that it would simply just fire it off and then redirect you, regardless of if that actually worked or not. And that's a bit of a problem for us, because before we redirect them, we need to know, was there an error? And if so, we need to display it to the user and tell them, hey, this actually didn't work. So the way that we initially did it is we would have a callback function here, and that would pass us the error if there was an error. And then it would pass us the actual store, or the document, as it's called in MongoDB. You can call that whatever you want. And then in here you say, if there is no error, then you can take your redirect and take your console log, it worked, and put it up inside of here. Now, that's a lot of code just for a simple saving of a store. What happens if you need to first query 3 or 4 stores, then loop over the data, then save 2 of those actual stores? You can see how this code would get really complicated if you need to have any sort of order of operation inside of your actual code. Because in here, then once it worked, maybe you would take another one like reviews dot, and like you would find all of the reviews. And then when that is done, you have the error and the reviews. And then when that is done, you want to redirect them. You can see how like things just start getting nested deeper and deeper and deeper. If you just want to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, if you want to do 6 things before you actually send some data to the actual user, your code gets to be looking like what's called a Christmas tree code, or this is referred to as callback hell, where you have nested data over and over and over again. So that's not a great way to code your app. You will see a lot of example code online like that because that's how it was for many, many years. But if we let's bring it back, bring it back, bring it back. Let's bring it back just to this right here, store.save. What we have now transitioned over to is using Mongoose with what's called promises. And promises will immediately return to you, not the data, whether it worked or not, because that's impossible. What it will return to us is a promise, which is sort of like an IOU note for I will eventually come back to you with either the data which the store saved or the data that you queried, or an error saying something had happened. So we had changed we take that save out, put it on its own line, take the semicolon off, and then we would chain.then, which is what you use in a promise. And the reason why we can use a promise is because if you look back at our start.js, remember we did this? Mongoose.promise equals global.promise. What this does is it first tells Mongoose that we are using promises. And second, it tells us that we're using built-in ES6 promises because there are additional promise libraries like Bluebird and whatnot. But now that ES6 promises are out, we can just use them. So you have then, you have a store that comes back, and then you could say like res.json, the actual store data. And if there's an error, you catch the error, and then you do something, throw error with the actual error in there. So that's good. And the beauty of that is you can chain store. So maybe you wanted to save the store, but then you wanted to return store.find all of the stores because you wanted to immediately display a list of all of the stores, like the latest 10. And then what that will allow you to do is you can chain stores. And that will allow us to do like res.render store list, and you want to pass it a list of the stores, which is your stores. So that's great because you can chain these things on and on and on as long as you possibly want, as long as each one of these is returning some sort of promise from each of the thens. So that made things a little bit easier because we're not in callback hell anymore. We're just in sort of chaining promise land. The promised land is chained, but we can do even better. In ES8, we have something called async await, which also does away with all of this then, and catch. So let's go back to here. Let's bring the save back onto its own line. Now, let's say I wanted a console log. It worked only once the save has finished. The way that we can do that is we can tell JavaScript, hey, hold on a second, just like cool your jets and wait until I've done this save and then continue on. And that's with something called async await. And the way that that works is you go to your function and you mark this function as async, and that will tell the browser or Node.js that, hey, this function that I'm using is going to have some awaits inside of it, or possibly have some awaits inside of it. And then we can go in front of the thing that returns a promise and simply await it, because store.save will return to us a promise, and we then can await it, meaning that we will not move on to line 16 until the save has successfully happened. Good. So don't worry too much if this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We're going to be doing it quite a bit, especially if you're brand new to promises. It can be a little bit of a whoa, but we'll get it as we go along. One more thing that we need to know about async await is that there's no, you notice that before we had a callback that passed an error, or we had a .catch that gave us the error. In order to catch an error with async await, you generally have to wrap your entire code in a try. You try all this stuff, and then you have this like fallback catch will give you the error. And if that happens, you need to do something with your actual error in here, maybe console log it or send the user to a 404 page or whatnot. And I'm not a huge fan of that because the whole try catch thing, the whole beauty of async await is that you don't have to have all this nested code. And if you have to wrap your code in this ugly try catch, it's a bit of a bummer. So 2 solutions. Just don't write code that has bugs, which is what I do. I'm Chucky. You can't ever do that because if there is an error, your Node.js process will quit on you, and it's not good to happen. So you always have to handle your errors, even if you think you're amazing at programming and you never write errors. So how are we going to handle that? Well, one cool way is that we can use something called composition, which is you can take this create store and wrap it in another function that will catch any errors. So we create a higher function that wraps create store. And if any of this code in here was to throw an error, if anything like weird was to happen inside of here, we will have a function that wraps it that will handle all of our error handling, which is really, really nice. So I've already coded this function for you. Let's open up errorhandlers.js. And you see this catch errors here. What this will do, and this is essentially just a middleware that we can use here, is it will take in the function, which in our case is the create store function, and it will return a function that calls it. This is like a function that calls a function. And if there is an error, it will catch it and call .next. Okay. Follow with me. And what next will do is, if we look at our app.js, remember we have all of our routes. Where are they? Here we go. App.use routes. And all of our routes are going to be wrapped in this error handler here. So if any of our routes hit an error, this error handler is going to kick in and it's going to catch the error because we don't want to have to do it. It's going to catch it for us and it's going to immediately call next. And what next will do is it's just going to say, okay, well, something happened. We're not going to use any of these routes here. We're just going to pass it along the chain of middleware, which is either going to be a not found or a validation flash error, which we're going to talk about, or it's going to, most likely, it's going to be this one, which is going to either show us our development errors or our production errors. So I know that's a little bit confusing because there's a whole lot of steps that has to filter through, but we will keep coming back to how this works and as we go along. But the main thing that we need to learn about here is that if you do not wrap your async await functions in a try catch, you need to wrap it in this catch errors function right here so that it will handle all of the errors for you. Let's go back to our routes here, and we need to then import that error handler because this create store function, it is async await, so it needs to be wrapped in that catch error function. We need to use composition, which is wrapping a function in a function. So we will do this. We'll say const curly brackets catch errors equals require, and we'll go up a level into our handlers directory, and then we'll grab our error handlers.js file. Don't need the .js on the end. So, whoa, we haven't done this before. What is this? This is just something called object destructuring, which will allow us to import an entire object, which will have an object exports.catchError, exports.notfound, exports.flash validation. We don't need all of these. We just need catch errors. So by taking destructuring, if you've taken my ES6 course, you'll know that what that will do is it just creates a variable called catch errors. And it's not necessary to import the entire thing and then grab a property off of it. We can simply just import the one method that we need. And then we'll take this catch errors and wrap our controller that is async await. So essentially what this is going to do is it's immediately going to run catch errors when you boot up your application. And catch errors is going to take that function, wrap it in another function, a higher order function, and then return to us that function with a catch tacked on to the end that will then handle pushing up to the next value. So again, don't worry too much if that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It's a bit confusing, but it's a nice, clean way for us to just catch any of the errors and push them along to some later middleware rather than us have to catch the error in every single controller that we have and then to handle it. And here we don't have to handle the errors unless we explicitly want to do the error handling in a special way. We simply just let the errors happen, let the error handler catch it for us, and then push it along our middleware stack so that one of our error handlers: not found, validation errors, development errors, or production errors. One of these middlewares is going to figure out which one should be actually displaying it for us. So, let's go here back to our create store function. We have our sync. We are waiting the store.save. When the store is saved, we are going to redirect them. Well, let's just redirect them to the home page for now. So res.redirect to /. So give it a save. Let's go back to our add folder here. Let's try add a store called bakery. And the description is I love bread. And we're going to make it vegetarian and open late and give it a save. Woo, look what happened there. It saved the data and then redirected us to the home page. How do we know if it worked? Well, we can open up our MongoDB Compass application here, and we can connect back to our Compass database that we have. So either you are on localhost or you are on your MLab, depending on which one you have. It should be still in your sidebar here. If you ever forget your username and password, again, you can just open up that variables.env, and here you will see your username, your password, your host, your port, and your database name. So those are, if you ever forget it, it will always be in your variables.env file. So I'm going to connect to that, and we find our database. And you'll now see if you go to stores, one, click it, and click on documents. And you'll see that there's the bakery. The slug has been made, lowercase. The name, I love bread. And then we added a couple tags. There they are, open, late, and vegetarian. Let's try it again. Go to add. We're going to add fish market. Shout out to catch of the day. And let's say a licensed. You have a beer at a fish market. Click on save. Good. It just redirected us to the home page. But if I click on refresh, second one has now been popping up. So that's all you need in order to save data to a database. You first create your schema, what your data looks like. And then in your controller, you create a new version from that schema and you call .save on it. And because we use async await, there's no nested callbacks. There's no promise chaining .then. It's simply just wait for it to save, then do some data.